Buffalo soldiers, buffalo soldiers, buffalo soldiers, buffalo soldiers, buffalo soldiers, explorers and mountaineers, have you been praised for your bravery? As you gallantly rode your steed, caravanning sanctuaries with your bodies. There's no fear from the fire within, building trails with the rest of us to follow. Buffalo soldier, buffalo soldier.
Live right, live.
Buffalo soldier. Fighting in the war, standing in the flames, risking your lives. Tell me, what more can a more give? All those opposed on your existence as you save their lives. Pulled on all sides, indigenous and white, maintaining your defense for black pride. We salute you, we salute you.
I'm a soldier, I told ya, with a blue hat, none's colder. It's time to come for ya, with the musket, I bust it. The people, they trust it, stay well or no rusting. Yo, rushing to fight, yo, I'm rushing my life, yo. I'm fighting with natives, not traders, we greater. We round by these mountains and stay by these fountains. Love to pull up on these horses out north on, we under attack. Yo, I simply am black, black,
yeah,
black.
Yeah.
Live,
We salute you, and we praise you, and we praise you, and we thank you, and we thank you. Keep on moving,
Buffalo soldier. Live, right, live,
Buffalo soldier.
live, right, Buffalo.
Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Hastings, executive producer for World Channel. I want to welcome you to our Meet the Makers event for the release of Buffalo Soldiers Fighting on Two Fronts, which is premiering later tonight on PBS. We have a really good panel conversation coming up in a little bit. But before we get into it, I'm just going to do a few thank yous and acknowledgments. First of all, I want to thank you to our funders, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the MacArthur Foundation, Wyncote Foundation, PBS, and GBH Boston. Thank you. Buffalo Soldiers Fighting on Two Fronts, again, is an amazing story that looks at the history of the Buffalo Soldiers. But as we look at the history of the Buffalo Soldiers, we have to also make sure that we are acknowledging our indigenous community. And here at WGBH, we've been really looking at indigenous history and trying to make sure that we are sharing work that is authentic and acknowledges a very complicated history that we have here in the United States. Our land acknowledgement centers us at Massachusetts, where GBH is based. GBH honors the Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, and Nipmuc peoples, whose ancestral lands provide the foundation for GBH Massachusetts studios, bureaus, and transmitter. We honor the cultures, contributions, connections of Native Indigenous peoples to our work, our local community, our Commonwealth, and our nation. Further, we recognize the importance of moving beyond just acknowledgement, but towards action. We commit to learning from, including, and elevating Native Indigenous peoples' perspectives, voices, language, locally and nationally, through our public media mission. And I can tell you, as we release this film this week, we authentically want to make sure that we're including Indigenous voices in this story in particular. Tonight, you are going to meet the director of the film, Dru Holley. I'm not going to be moderating it, but I have a dear friend, Stephanie Frederick, from Frederick Networks Productions, who has worked with World Channel for many years. She's going to take over moderating this panel tonight, and you'll get to meet her in a little bit. But before I turn it over to Stephanie, I'm going to show the trailer for Buffalo Soldiers Fighting on Two Fronts.
When we tell our stories, we leave the black stories out. And the Buffalo Soldiers were a perfect example of that.
Telling the story of the Buffalo Soldiers is a means of reestablishing that which was already there.
Being capable of great deeds was not something that society was willing to admit that black people were capable of doing.
The Army gave him the only part of the American dream that the nation would let him share.
It gave them a sense of respect to wear the uniform of the United States, to potentially sacrifice their life for the United States because of their ferocity in battle and the texture of their hair. They began to call them Buffalo Soldiers as a term of respect.
We say African-American history, but we got to get out of that. It's American history.
Welcome to the world. Meet the Maker. Will be your moderator for today's event. The World's Meet the Maker brings together diverse filmmakers and thought leaders from all around the world to discuss stories in our documentaries and how they connect to our everyday lives. So we're excited about today's panel, which kicks off the release of the documentary Buffalo Soldiers Fighting on Two Fronts. The film is going to debut tonight on PBS across the country. You'll also be able to catch it on the PBS app and the World YouTube channel. So joining us is Dru Holley, the director and producer of the film. Later today, later in just a few minutes, we're also going to meet two Buffalo Soldier historians, Dr. Ryan Booth, who's featured in the film, and Jason Fung, who's an archivist and Buffalo Soldiers, an archivist and military historian at the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum in Houston. And if you haven't been down there, you must go. The Buffalo Soldiers National Museum in Houston, Texas. But first, let's meet filmmaker Dru Holley. Dru, welcome to Meet the Makers. Let's see, I don't think we have your audio.
Hey, Stephanie, I'm excited for
How,
this.
well, you should be. I got to tell you, this is a remarkable film. It's an informative film. I love history, and if anyone loves history, you're going to love seeing the story tonight. I know that you have said that this isn't the first Buffalo Soldier story, and you hope that it won't be the last. But talk to me a little bit about why you wanted to take this journey, why you wanted to tell us, come in with a different entry point of the Buffalo Soldiers fighting on two fronts.
Yeah, so the story is 5 years ago, 2018, I was volunteering at the Langston Hughes Juneteenth Festival out of Seattle, and they were doing a festival for Juneteenth. I brought my 6-year-old daughter with me so she could check out the festival while I captured footage. And after a while, I heard my daughter say, "Ooh, horsies." And when I looked up from my camera, I seen this all-black regiment straight out of the 19th century galloping up the hill on horseback, and they were the Buffalo Soldiers of Seattle Living History Group. My baby then, she asked me, "Who are they, Daddy?" And I was stumped. I couldn't think for the life of me who these gentlemen were. Then something dawned on me, and it maybe been the Bob Marley song that I heard a lot in college, or maybe the Danny Glover movie I had watched some time ago, or I thought I watched. And I said, I think those are Buffalo Soldiers. And her next obvious question is, who are the Buffalo Soldiers? Right? And doing some research, I could find little bits and pieces of information about the Buffalo Soldiers, a couple little videos. So being the filmmaker I am and being an elder in my community and wanting my daughter to have more education on our history than I did, I thought it was, I went out and set out on this journey to make this film.
Awesome. For people who don't know, tell us, who are the Buffalo Soldiers?
The Buffalo Soldiers are all-black regiment created by Congress in 1868, part of the Reorganization Act. And they were primarily fought in the Indian Wars and up until World War I.
And Dru, when I think about as a filmmaker and a documentary filmmaker on top of that, talk a little bit about your process and your approach to telling this story when, I know you didn't have any video, any moving images, or, there wasn't Google, there wasn't television clips. How did you do it?
We were fortunate enough to have a lot of local historians that knew this story, right? This story it's not as hidden as we think, right? If we reach out to some of our elders, they know the stories of the Buffalo Soldiers. So we were fortunate enough to have a lot of local people here in the Pacific Northwest, like Quintar Taylor, Dr. Milner, Dr. Booth, um, Greg Shine, that were local, even Shelton, who's just down in Yosemite. This wasn't an easy process. This was my first feature documentary. We we spent 4 years making it, right? And I was under the delusion that it would only take me a year to make a historical feature film, but so it wasn't. It was a lot of trials and error. We this was like our 12th cut before we finally got to the one that could tell the story in the way that we want to tell it.
Tell us some of the challenges that you were facing. 4 years is a long time, brother.
I think all the challenges that a lot of the independent filmmakers have is, finding funding for the project, right? Our project, took it took us that whole time to find the right amount of money to be able to do what we wanted to in the film. So of course, finding funding. A lot of the Buffalo Soldiers, or excuse me, the Black soldier archival images are collectibles, so they're in a lot of private collections. Luckily, we had a great research producer, Dave Hedberg, who was tracking down everything. He was finding me everything that I needed. He was getting them cleared. We had Anthony Powell, who had a substantial amount of these images that he done collected and curated over the years. So, yeah, we're very fortunate in that way. Great research team and people willing to help us.
Okay, so the Buffalo Soldiers are an all-black regiment. The next question is, why did they call them Buffalo Soldiers? Based
So
on what you've learned.
you'll find out in the film, but from what I learned, they got their name from the Native Americans, and this is, some is legend and folk tale, but some of it could happen to be real. So we have a lot of scholars tell their different opinions on how they got their name. From what I've heard from all of them is the Native Americans gave them their name, and it was due to their, the Native Americans had a lot of honor in the buffalo. There was their main food source. There was their way of life was the buffalo. So when they seen these dark-skinned cavalrymen, right, with hair like the matted cushion of the buffalo, and the way that they fought, they gave them the name Buffalo Soldiers, and the black soldiers held that with pride, well into the 20th century. Some historians will argue Buffalo Soldiers were veterans of the Indian Wars, but again, up until integration, all the black soldiers held that title.
And they wore it with pride, as you mentioned.
They wore it with pride, for sure.
Dru, I know you wanted to set the record straight in this film about the Buffalo Soldiers. And one of the major points that I like that you make in this film is about the Battle of San Juan Hill. So before you answer, I want to go to this clip about the man who took credit for the Battle of San Juan Hill, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about how you set the record straight. So if you can, and Chris, if you can roll that clip.
Roosevelt was a prima donna. He had never been in the military before. He literally organized the Rough Riders out of whole cloth, despite the fact that he had no military background. And he sort of pushed his way in to lead the Rough Riders in Cuba.
We've all heard the story of Teddy Roosevelt charging up San Juan Hill. Now the real story. They charged up San Juan Hill after the 10th Cavalry had breached the defenses.
A black soldier, Sergeant George Berry of the 10th Cavalry, planted the flags atop the hill. Roosevelt and his men arrived well after the 10th and the 3rd Cavalry, a white regiment.
If it had not been for the timely aid of the 10th Cavalry, the Rough Riders would have been exterminated. Sergeant Lewis Bowman, 10th Cavalry, Tampa Morning Tribune.
After the battle was over, there are all the official photographs. And the photograph that we most see now in classrooms is Theodore Roosevelt standing in the middle and his Rough Riders all around him. If you extend that photograph out, then you'll see the black soldiers. And in a way, that's a metaphor for what happened on San Juan Hill, that it is assumed that Theodore Roosevelt led the Rough Riders up. They were the ones who defeated the Spanish, and that broke the back of Spanish resistance and led to the American victory. In fact, it was a victory that belonged as much to the Buffalo Soldiers.
That's remarkable. That is our president, the man who would become our president, Teddy Roosevelt. Tell me why you wanted to set the record straight with that one.
I think that was a good way to start out the film, right, and telling this larger story of American history that is not as as it's been presented throughout, throughout this whole time, right? To kind of cut out the Black soldiers' contribution uh, to Americans' development, I feel like that's what that image does, right? So the point of this movie is to expand that lens so that you can see the different contributions of the Buffalo Soldiers, as well as uh, the not so flattering parts of American history.
But Dru, history still shows that it was Teddy Roosevelt who went up to the top of San Juan Hill and took it over, planted the flag there. I mean, you can look on Google, you can look on, and some key, uh, good research material for history, and it still mentions the battle was proved to be the greatest victory for Commander Teddy Roosevelt. So let me bring in our other panelists now so they can weigh in on this as well. Professor Ryan Booth, who is Dr. Ryan, Dr. Ryan Booth from Washington State University. He's featured in a film. Dr. Booth specializes in the history of the U.S. in the 19th century and early 20th, up until World War I. His primary interests are in the indigenous and military history. Our second panelist, Jason Fung. He's an archivist and military historian at the Buffalo Soldiers National Museum and History. Both are subject matter experts here. Gentlemen, what do you make that the history still reflects that it was Teddy Roosevelt rather than the Buffalo Soldiers who marched up San Juan Hill? I'll start with you, Dr. Booth.
Thank you for this, and thank you, Dru, for including me in this film. I'd say, this is part of, as Dru was sort of saying there, this is an American story, and it's one that I think we are now in the process of sort of expanding that category of what it means to be an American, and it means telling more complete stories. And I think that's part of what we're sort of learning in this film is that, the stories that we might have grown up with are not inaccurate, but they weren't the complete story. And I think that's kind of what we're doing is rounding this out and sort of making it into a bigger, broader picture, which makes for an even richer understanding of what it means to be a part of the United States of America.
Jason, how do we set the record straight? How are you guys doing it down at the museum? I don't think we have his audio. Stand by.
Me being
Stand
a
by,
military.
Jason.
Okay.
Go ahead.
As I was
How do
saying,
we set the record straight?
at our museum here, we have a little interesting take on this thing about San Juan. We acknowledge that San Juan was probably the pinnacle of the Buffalo Soldiers' military achievement. After all, they did save the president. However, what we like to talk about is the president isn't really as great as he was. He, as the documentary will state, Theodore Roosevelt didn't really have any military experiences, and so he wasn't really fully aware of prescribed cavalry doctrines as well as military tactics involved. The Rough Riders, of course, during this time period, a lot of people imagine them being cavalry forces, so troops on horseback. But in reality, at the Battle of San Juan, these cavalry forces were actually dismounted and were treated as irregular infantry units, which meant that they weren't really designed to actually charge up that hill. And so, of course, with soldiers that are not equipped charging up a hill, they tend to get destroyed. Luckily, the 10th Cavalry were more equipped infantrymen, and so they were able to save the Rough Riders from their disastrous military transactions. Yes.
And Dru, why do you think this story has been, I'm just going to say, reported wrong?
What'd you say, Stephanie? You cut out a little bit.
Why do you think the story has not been reported accurately that it was the Buffalo Soldiers who charged at that hill?
Well, Stephanie, to put it frank, it's been whitewashed, right? We want America's done a good job as selling us this white savior narrative, right, and leaving out the contributions and what they maybe felt at the time was inferior racist contributions into the actual what really happened and maybe what saved the war and what put us in the position that we are. They're real good about, and with all due respect, bringing up, the more, Dr. Martin Luther King, Frederick Douglass, or Rosa Parks, leaving out a wide variety of other Black and indigenous Americans who have contributed to this country's success.
Another thing that we hear about the Buffalo Soldiers is that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet they still won. What an amazing piece of history for young people to learn about and know about. Tell me, what made them such fierce fighters?
I also want to say that I think our educators maybe have been fed that too, right? They haven't had the resources like this film, and I hope this film is a resource. I hope it's not the last Buffalo Soldiers film, but yet a catalyst to continue to tell these type of stories. So now that the information is out there, I urge educators to rent it and teach it to their classrooms about this other perspective of American history.
And Dr. Booth, how does the repression of history impact us now?
Well, as I was sort of saying there, I think this not telling complete pictures leaves out those voices, as Dru was saying. It leaves out important little clues to how our country has sort of been put together, and it wasn't just the story of, say, elite people. We in history have for a long time focused on what was known as sort of the great man theory of history. So focusing on people like Teddy Roosevelt as sort of embodying everything that it meant to be an American, which, he is part of the American story for sure. But, there are a lot of other folks, regular folks, just like you and me, who are part of this. And those voices have been sort of squashed out. And I think that leads to, sort of people feeling disengaged or sort of not a part of. And I think that isn't, to me, that's not history. We ought to have skin in the game, so to speak, in this sort of, we all have a part to, in these stories. And I think that's important to recognize.
Let me move on to something that I also think is very important here. Like I mentioned earlier, you studied the indigenous and the military history. It's no secret that the Buffalo Soldiers, one of their main jobs in the westward expansion of the country was, as they called it, the phrase was Indian removal. So let's take a look at that clip, and then we'll come back. And Professor, I'd like you to address that.
It isn't until the end of the Civil War that the nation's energy shifts, and they're suddenly interested in Western land, in expansion, manifest destiny. Extending America from shore to shore, from sea to sea, was kind of an official policy, but it was also an attitude. Most people forget that we are on lands that once had all of this rich Native American life, that there were people who were living and dying and being born on these lands.
In order for the quest for continental expansion to succeed, the indigenous peoples who had lived on the land for thousands of years had to be dealt with.
They're building these railroads through native homelands, which inevitably creates conflict.
Indian removal, as it came to be called, required a larger military force. In 1866, Congress authorized the formation of 30 new units.
And that included 2 African-American cavalry units and 4 African-American infantry units.
Dr. Booth, how is this viewed and how does this complicate the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers?
Well, I think this gets at some of the big issues for this film, and I'm glad I was able to be a part of it. You know, I'm a member of the Upper Skagit tribe, and so these things are important to me to be able to add a voice for Indigenous people. And what happened here in the West, you know, these Buffalo Soldiers, you know, there's different words that the U.S. Army used, which are sort of euphemisms for what was happening. So things like pacification, you know, so that word pacification, it means peace, right? It means bringing peace. So to pacify a people, you know, through violent means is that's an extraordinary turn of phrase that the Army used in the U.S. Indian Wars, and I think, you know, this is, but it's not just Buffalo Soldiers, but it's also Native people themselves, which is part of my research, is on the U.S. Indian Scouts. So Dru mentioned that act, the Army Reorganization Act from 1866. And that act created 2 things. One, it created the Buffalo Soldiers, but then on the other hand, it created the U.S. Indian Scouts. And those 2 things existed at the same time, as Congress and the president were looking west after the Civil War, trying to figure out, you know, how to, you know, make the West safe for settlement. And so that was their whole intent in doing this. And, you know, the Scouts, alongside the Buffalo Soldiers, play a role in that, and those things complicate this story of the settlement of the American West.
And Dru, your approach in the film, tell me why your approach was the way it was. I don't want to give it away because I want people to watch tonight, but talk a little bit about the Native American aspect to this and how it does seem to, you know, the Buffalo Soldiers were there to do a job, but it had to be a tough job. I can only imagine we're coming out of slavery and there's internal conflict there. And now you're being asked to tell the indigenous people, the Native Americans, you know, you've got to go. We got to move you back to the reservation. How did you want to handle that?
You know, that was something I struggled with early on. I set out to make a real aspirational film about the Buffalo Soldiers, and learning about these different conflicts was a bit of a struggle for me. And then the Buffalo Soldiers fighting on 2 fronts, we delve into complexities of history of, you know, race, class, powerlism, and colonialism as while we tell the true story of the Buffalo Soldiers. But it's important to recognize their commendable action, but also acknowledge their involvement in the suppression of the native tribe. These men were former sharecroppers from the South, the majority of them, right, getting an opportunity to make $13 a month more than they ever have, or their fathers or grandfathers ever had in their whole life. Throughout, from the beginning of making this and understanding that, it was important to have, and thank you, Ryan, for Dr. Booth. When I first met Ryan, he was still a graduate student. And he didn't have a beard, as you can see. He was still just a young man. So it was 4 years ago. But it was important to have, and it's not like Ryan can speak for a whole, you know, nation of people, but to have that perspective, right? We couldn't tell this story without having a native voice to help us through this part.
And the relationship today, Dr. Booth, and to Jason, the relationship today, as you see it, between Native American and African American, I would say that there's a conversation to be had here. And what should that conversation look like?
Well, it seems to me that this is, I think part of it begins with a film like this. It starts with sort of knowing this history. I think that's part of the biggest problem right now, is that people don't know this story and they don't know what happened and why. And then you can begin to have more in-depth conversations with each other and begin to understand that this was, this was all part of as we were emerging out of the Civil War, kind of a redefinition of what it means to be an American and how an American acts. And so I think these are the sorts of things that that we could begin to have more dialogue about, and sort of and what that history means to our communities. I think there are some commonalities. If we look more for the similarities instead of the differences, I think we can find some common threads through these stories that I think would be important to sort of build on.
But the history is a bit disturbing, is it not, for some?
Yeah, but it's true. Not to to black and white history is, and excuse, pardon the term, it's a true history, right? We can't honor the Buffalo Soldiers or our Native American brothers and sisters without telling the true history. So yes, it opens it up for dialogue, and that's what we hope it to do.
Jason?
Well, history has always been a very bloody and messy scenario. It's a lot of dark times, a lot of gray. It's not always black and white. And I think what's important is, of course, open dialogue is quite important here, and that's what we try to promote here at our museum, is open dialogue. But also to understand the historical context. Buffalo Soldiers were originally created to become a constabulary frontier force, aka a border patrol in a sense. And frontiers was very much the border or the Wild West that a lot of people seem to romanticize during the time. And the frontier life was not easy to deal with. There's a lot of diseases, a lot of poor conditions, and just a whole bunch of outside civilization, outside the comforts. And so people couldn't really sort of adapt to that scenario. And I think both African Americans and Native Americans shared the similarity of, being outside of the quote unquote civilized white world. And I think this is a starting point to where we can have dialogue to see, how these two races interacted with each other. And Buffalo Soldiers is a great example, although bloody and sometimes misrepresented. It is still history, and it's still something that they did, and of course they were just soldiers trying to, as Mr. Dru said, trying to earn that $13 a month and trying to make a living, in a sense.
Dr. Booth, are there some stories that have been shared down through the years that maybe we see a different side to the relationship?
I think different tribal communities. My research is on U.S. Indian Scouts in particular, and when you talk to some of the communities that served as Scouts, but also were part of the U.S. Indian Wars. They have memories too, and not all of them are positive about the Buffalo Soldiers, and that's part of this. That's part of this history, and I think. Native people were defending their homelands, right? And you have to think about that. Anybody, I think, put in that position, when you think about war or the military, folks who are protecting their homelands will do anything to, make sure that their families are safe, and they will fight to the last person, and to protect those things that they think are important. And anyway, so I think that some of those stories do exist in those communities, and I think part of that would be sort of the a film like this could sort of begin to start those conversations and sharing those memories, and and sort of being willing to face history, full on, head on. It's history's never easy, and it's never simple. I'm always suspicious if somebody wants to tell me a very simple story, because humans are complicated, right? I mean, we are really, really have a lot of different motivations and reasons for doing things, and so I think we're messy too, which I think that's the other trait that you could probably say about all humans. And so I think this is the real history. This is the sort of stuff that I think, we live in a complex, complicated world, and simple answers just won't do the trick. But if we begin to look at these sorts of stories that are more complex and sort of tell these more complicated stories, we might be able to make some progress as a country.
Drew, you say, go ahead.
I would like to also add that there is a Indian Scouts Fighting on Two Fronts film needs to be made out there, right? I'm not the director to bring that vision, but I will help a Native director produce such a film. So if any of you out there listening, the Indian Scouts Fighting on Two Fronts, let's make that part 2.
I like that. Drew, there had to be a surprise in some of your research. I want to show our next clip, which I think was a big shock to me as a woman. And I think this is going to surprise a lot of people. And we'll learn a lot about our Buffalo soldier, Williams Kathy. Or is it Kathy Williams? Roll the clip, Chris.
In Missouri, another former slave chooses to enlist under the assumed name of William Kathy because she was female. She was born Kathy Williams in Independence, Missouri in September 1844.
There were few opportunities for aspiring young Black women in this time period beyond marriage or beyond domestic service to white society.
Once owned by a wealthy farmer, Kathy was liberated by the Union Army, but pressed into service as war contraband.
When the war broke out and the United States soldiers came to Jefferson City, they took me and the other colored folk with them. I did not want to go. Colonel Benton wanted me to cook for the officers. Kathy Williams, 1862.
The 22-year-old had no experience as a cook and was soon reassigned to the laundry, exploited by the Yankees as she had been by her former master. After the war, used to the military life, she disguised herself as a man to enlist in the regular army near St. Louis, Missouri on November 15, 1866.
I wanted to make my own living and not be dependent on relations or friends.
How she was able to get into the infantry, during that time to me, is still amazing.
William Kathy passes a clearly superficial examination and is assigned to Company A of the 38th Infantry.
I carried my musket and did guard and other duties while in the Army.
Drew, that had to surprise you. Tell me about discovering Kathy Williams as a Buffalo soldier.
I felt like for a long time as we was working on this project, the story of Kathy Williams might have been a myth, right? I wasn't getting any definitive answers. I couldn't find any images, but no, it's a true story, right? And as you'll discover in the film, Moses Williams, who is our kind of our storyteller, the character who we follow throughout through the Western expansion, and Charles Young was the character we followed as America turned of the century, excuse me, turn of the century, and as America went across the Pacific to establish an empire. Kathy Williams' story didn't necessarily fit in those two, right? This is a vast history that we were trying to tell in an hour, so we needed these characters to kind of take us through this time. Kathy Williams' story was so important, right? There was a lot of stories that got left on the cutting room floor that hurts my heart. One being the Buffalo Soldiers, Iron Riders, who rode from Manzulana all the way down to St. Louis, or or the Native Scouts, right? Who Ryan Booth, gave us so much information on. But Kathy Williams' story is one that we wouldn't let go, right? It was one that had to stay in the film, for my daughter and for everyone else's daughter, and her story was important. There's no images of her, and maybe Jason knows of some that I don't, but there's no images of her. So coming up with the depiction of her was fun.
Jason, let me ask you how you guys and how the museum, the Buffalo Soldiers Museum, certainly showcases Kathy Williams. Tell me what you can add to what you know about this woman Buffalo soldier.
To answer Drew's question first, unfortunately, we don't have any depictions of William Cathy or Cathy Williams to the best of our knowledge. They could be out there, just we don't have it in our archives at the moment. However, a couple things I do want to add to Mr. Drew's excellent narration and the history of Cathy Williams. Number one is Kathy Williams is actually the first documented African American woman to serve in Buffalo Soldiers. Now, this isn't to say that she's the only one, but she's the only one with actual documentations that we have here at the museum and at the National Archives as well. Another cool thing that that story you just saw was that not shown is that Kathy Williams is actually a very good sharpshooter. In fact, during her military service, while short as it may be, she won a sharpshooter's medal. So that's quite an achievement. After all, the firearms that they were used were not always accurate, and the fact that she got the medal for that is quite an achievement of itself. And then finally, to add more to that narrative, at the beginning you saw how they said Kathy Williams wasn't really a great cook. General Sheridan of the Union Army at the time made her go to a military camp in Virginia to train her how to cook. And it's that skill that she trained to learn how to cook for the officers that eventually would carry her past her military service, as in the documentary will go on to show that after military service, she goes to Colorado, in Trinidad, Colorado, to earn a living cooking and doing laundry.
I'm still amazed at how she was able to pull it off.
It was clearly superficial exam, as we say in the film. It was clearly superficial, or otherwise she wouldn't have been able to.
You're saying no one checked?
Not really, I guess. What would you say, Jason?
Jason, what do you think?
Well, to understand, during this time period, a lot of the surgeons and nurses in charge of the medical division would have been white officers, and normally white officers didn't really care to take a second glance at an African American soldier, because they were lower on their priorities. And so, yes, these exams would have been superficial, and only really checked when she actually needed to go into surgery for her conditions. And some of her conditions, she was put in clinic and just made to rest instead of actually doing surgery. But on the last trip, I believe it was Fort Bayard, one of the ones in New Mexico, they actually had to operate on her, and that's how they found out she was a woman, when they unclothed her for the operation table.
What a surprise.
Yes.
Drew, are there
Much
any other surprises? Anything else that was a surprise for you as you were doing your research?
Yeah, understanding how America acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and some of those territories was new to me. I didn't really know much about the Spanish American War, about the Filipino War. So understanding that was really cool to learn that history, and yeah, it was a surprise. And even I guess how the war started, right? The explosion of the USS Maine, and learning that it was probably a mechanical issue, and America used that as a declaration of war, and jumped in this because they wanted to establish an empire. So yeah, that was all news, and it was exciting to learn.
And let me ask Jason and Dr. Booth, any other hidden histories of the Buffalo Soldier? Things you think people should know about the Buffalo Soldier? Dr. Booth or Jason? Let's see, can they hear me?
Oh, so I guess if I'm, I would say, I think the history of which is the Buffalo Soldiers sort of in their role in places like our national parks. I think that is another important aspect of this history. So that the Buffalo Soldiers were sent to help protect some of the our places that we hold most dear. I think I don't know, as a former National Park Service ranger, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't say something about that. It's been called America's best idea, and those places are really special to us, in the United States. And Buffalo Soldiers played a part in protecting them for future generations, and I think that's an important role that is one that we ought to remember too.
A hidden history that you'd like to share, Jason?
As for me, I'd like the recognition of the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers because they were the ones that paved the road for other African American units to fight in the U.S. military, such as the 92nd Infantry Division, as well as the 93rd Infantry Division in World War I and World War II. But most importantly, the Buffalo Soldiers laid the foundation for other African American units to join not only just the Army, but other branches as well. So you would have, without the Buffalo Soldiers, would not have had the Tuskegee Airmen. You would not have, of course, the Red Ball Express and other important tank battalions that were in World War II, as well as combat support infantry like engineers and a lot of the snappers that you saw in World War II. And eventually, the culmination of this legacy in World War I, Spanish American War, World War II, would ultimately lead into the integration of the armed forces with President Truman signing Executive Order 9981 during the Korean conflict. And this really revolutionized the way African Americans experienced the American military because up until then, white troops and black troops didn't really fight together, brother by brother, and Vietnam would be that proving ground for this. And I mean, as you know, modern military campaigns today are very much reliant on every American to do their part.
Thank you, Jason. That was wonderful. Drew, as the filmmaker, what do you want audiences? What's the takeaway? What do you want audiences to walk away feeling and thinking after viewing this film? About the story of these soldiers.
I want people to take away that, um, again, our history is deeper and more complex as we've been taught over the years. To look into it further. Also, that we wouldn't be in the West, and the Buffalo Soldiers laid the foundation and the infrastructure for us to be out here in the West. Like you said, West Side Buffalo Soldiers, right? These men were out on that. Our history is deeper than slavery, civil rights, ghetto, and the entertainment that we've been presented, right? We have actual patriotic warriors in our history. So know that about yourself, and I think I'm talking to the Black community most right now, that we have a deeper history than what's been presented to us, and look into that history.
Well, thank you for this inspiring film. Thank you, Dru, Professor Ryan, and Jason, for giving us your time today. I want to just remind everyone that the Buffalo Soldiers Fighting on Two Fronts will be broadcast on PBS tonight at 10 p.m. Eastern. It's also streaming on the PBS app and on the World YouTube channel. And if you have any questions, Dru is going to be around for a live watch party this evening on the World's YouTube channel. Dru, you're going to be watching the film and taking questions as it streams, right?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yes.
Dru's going to be there for sure. And then the film is also going to be broadcast on Juneteenth on the World Channel. So thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Facebook Live and on YouTube. And be sure to share this conversation just to help to get the word out about the film and about the film's release tonight at 10 p.m. Again, thank you so much and have a great day.